A black man quietly stood up from his first-class seat and said just 6 words to a pregnant woman beside him. "Ma'am, you need this more." No cameras. No applause. Just a quiet act of kindness on a busy morning flight. What he didn't know, was that this simple gesture would uncover a hidden crime, save a family, and change his life forever. This is not just a story about giving up a seat. It's about breaking stereotypes, standing for what's right, and discovering that one small act can ripple far beyond anything you imagined. My name is David. And yes, that person was me. Have you ever felt like you're living a life that isn't really yours? Waking up each morning, doing the same things, seeing the same people yet feeling empty inside. I used to feel that way. I had a stable job, a loving family, but still felt something was missing. One day, I decided to pause and ask myself, what really matters to me? The journey of self-discovery wasn't easy, but it changed my life. And today, I want to share that story with you. That morning was clear and fresh, gentle sunlight streaming through the airport windows. A black man named David wasn't he particularly flashy. Khakis, a plain shirt, a slightly worn leather backpack, but his eyes were sharp, as if he'd learned to quietly observe the world. David had worked hard for that first-class ticket, not for the wine service or silverware. Simply because it was a long flight, and he wanted enough space to rest before an important presentation in an unfamiliar city where his professionalism would determine the outcome of a major deal for his company. As he took his seat, he noticed a few glances cast his way, not exactly hostile, but with a subtle ripple. People like him didn't often show up in first class. Not because they couldn't afford it, but because old biases still quietly lingered in the seams of society. He opened an old book, a novel his mother used to read to him in childhood, and exhaled softly. Finally, a moment of peace. But then, a pregnant woman entered. Her face showed exhaustion, one hand gently cradling her belly for balance amid the bustle. Beside her stood her husband, a well-dressed man, visibly anxious. The two paused in the aisle of first class, searching for something, perhaps someone willing to give up a seat. No one moved. Not a single empathetic glance. Each passenger seemed to draw an invisible border around their seat. David hesitated for a moment. Then stood up. "You need the seat more than I do," he said, voice warm and calm. The woman froze, deeply moved. The husband was speechless. The flight attendants looked at David with admiration. And without saying another word, he quietly picked up his backpack and walked to the back of the plane, finding a cramped seat between two large passengers. In that moment, he gave up comfort, not for attention, not for praise, not because someone was watching. Simply because it was the right thing to do. A similar story happened in 2019 in Canada, when a passenger named Kunal gave up his first-class seat to an 88-year-old grandmother flying for the first time. The story went viral on Twitter, shared by millions. People called it a simple, yet magnificent act of kindness. Sometimes, the best thing you do in a day isn't a grand achievement, but how you treat others in moments no one notices. And David had no idea that this small gesture would be the first step into a path of no return, where numbers, threats, and a family of strangers would teach him about courage and justice in a way no book ever had. People often called David reserved. He wasn't the type to walk into a room and own it. He didn't like noise. He didn't like proving he was better than anyone else. But he wasn't always like that. As a child, David was energetic. He loved asking questions, telling stories, and once dreamed of becoming a lawyer so he could talk a lot and defend the vulnerable. But school wasn't easy for a black boy with strong opinions. Once, he raised his hand to challenge the teacher during a history class. The result? A disciplinary note. His friends called him the troublemaker. Over time, he learned to stay quiet, not out of fear, but exhaustion from all the judgmental stares. That little boy grew up inside boxes people had built around him, dangerous, impulsive, undisciplined. And to escape those boxes, David chose to no longer stand out. He quietly studied, graduated with honors, and joined a tech company where black employees made up less than 5% of the engineering team. He was never late. Never raised his voice. Never asked too many questions. He just silently outperformed everyone else. David's silence wasn't retreat. It was a form of quiet resistance. Because to him, every flawless report, every well-written line of code, every time he helped a colleague solve a complex bug was a way to prove, I'm here, I'm capable, and I belong. David's story echoes that of Brian Stevenson, an African-American lawyer once removed from a courtroom by security because he didn't look like a lawyer. Yet he went on to save over 140 people from wrongful death sentences. Stevenson once said, "Our presence is a form of resistance against bias. Some fight with words. Some fight with protests. And some, like David, choose perseverance, choose to show up every day in places where they're not expected to be as a quiet, unyielding defiance against prejudice." And maybe, that's what made David unable to look away when he saw the pregnant woman standing in the first-class cabin. He understood what it felt like not to be welcome. He knew what it was like to be looked at as if you didn't belong. But in that moment, when he stood up and gave away his seat, something inside him shifted. For the first time in a long time, David acted on instinct, not the survival rules society had forced him to learn. And strangely, that one action opened a completely new path. After that flight, David expected nothing. To him, giving up his seat was just the right thing to do, not something to talk about again. But a few days later, while lining up for coffee in the hotel lobby, a familiar voice called from behind. "David, right." It was Tom, the husband of Lynn, the pregnant woman he gave his seat to. Tom smiled, a little awkward but sincere. "I know this might be sudden, but we'd like to invite you to dinner. Just to thank you for helping my wife on the flight." David was surprised. Random dinner invitations were things from movies, not real life. But somehow, the offer felt timely. That day, David had no one to meet, no place to go except a cold hotel room and a laptop full of spreadsheets. So he nodded. That dinner took place at a small restaurant tucked behind a row of ancient oak trees, under warm golden lights and soft jazz music. Nothing fancy. But it held all the sincerity David had forgotten he once needed. Tom spoke about his father-in-law, a businessman who had recently passed away, leaving behind both a fortune, and a financial mess they couldn't begin to understand. Lynn just smiled gently, occasionally placing her hand on her belly as if whispering to the baby inside. Her voice was low and soft. "We're not used to asking for help. But you seem like someone trustworthy. We need someone who understands numbers. Someone who can help us make sense of what's going on." David stayed quiet. At that moment, he didn't say yes. He didn't even think about getting involved. But something stirred inside him, something he couldn't quite explain. The trust of two people he had only just met, yet who seemed to see more in him than colleagues who had worked alongside him for years. David's story brings to mind a moment from the book The 5 People You Meet in Heaven, where what seemed like a small, insignificant act deeply impacted someone else's life, without the main character ever knowing. Sometimes, we don't even realize we're stepping into the most important part of our lives until it's already begun. You never know which dinner will change your life. Not because of the food, but because of the people, the unexpected words, and yourself when, for the first time, you listen to what you truly want to do, instead of what you should do. That night, back at the hotel, David didn't open his laptop. He sat by the window, city lights flickering in the distance, and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The sense that he was living for something bigger than himself. And he knew that the next day, when he received the files from Tom and Lynn, he would open them. He would look through them. He would help. Not out of obligation, but out of trust, that rare thing, which, when it appears, can change everything. The next morning, David opened his email. Subject: Documents from my father-in-law, thanks again. Attached was a compressed folder containing nearly 50 Excel files, some blurry scanned PDFs, and a few handwritten notes photographed on a phone. Nothing was organized. Nothing was clear. But to David, it felt familiar, a kind of chaos he could clean up. That's when the analyst in him kicked in. He began by grouping files by format, renaming them for easier tracking. Then came the process of identifying duplicate transactions, unusual payments, and especially entries with no clear description. He stared at spreadsheets for hours, flagging every number that looked off. And then, he started seeing the first signs. A recurring monthly payment of $4,200 to a strangely named company, H&L Logistics. But there was no contract. No note beyond a vague label, monthly arrangement. He looked up the company. No website. No phone number. Just a warehouse address on the outskirts near an old industrial park. Another transaction, $12,800 to Protective Services, but sent from a secondary account not listed in the main report. And so, the deeper David went, the more he felt like he was walking through a maze built to mislead anyone who tried to understand it. Many major financial scandals also began with small discoveries. A classic example is the Enron case, where an unknown analyst first noticed that the company's strong financial reports were in fact propped up by internal transactions between non-existent subsidiaries. It all started with a simple question: why are profits rising, but cash flow isn't? Data doesn't lie. But if arranged cleverly enough, even data can become a form of illusion. So, the truth isn't just in the numbers. It's in the shared patterns of what doesn't make sense. David knew that. And that's why he didn't stop. He created a chart, linking the accounts together, color-coded by category: legitimate, suspicious, and to be reviewed. When he sent his first summary to Tom and Lynn, Tom replied immediately. We don't fully understand it, but even at a glance, something feels very wrong. And what worried David most: some of the transactions were still happening, which meant someone was still controlling the money flow, even after Lynn's father had passed away. This was no longer just a matter of cleaning up the books. This could be a system still in motion, run by someone who didn't want the truth uncovered. The question was no longer what's wrong with these numbers. It was, who is behind this and why? David still thought he was just helping a family sort through a messy financial legacy. But when Tom called in the middle of the night, his voice panicked, David knew, this had gone far beyond spreadsheets. David, Tom gasped. We got a letter. No return address. Just a few words: stop. Don't dig deeper. There are things you shouldn't know. David was silent. It was no longer about silent numbers. Someone out there was watching them, and didn't want the truth exposed. The next day, Lynn sat quietly in the living room, gently rubbing her belly as if to comfort the unborn child. She spoke softly. We used to think it was all just a misunderstanding. But now, I'm starting to feel afraid. Not just about the money, but about my family's safety. David understood. He'd felt that kind of fear before, not from anonymous letters, but from the eyes of those who doubted him because of his skin color. That feeling of being watched, of not being trusted, of being unprotected. But this time, the fear wasn't aimed at him, and he couldn't ignore it. He rechecked the data. Cross-referenced money flows with vague names. One name came up again and again: C. Harris Shipping. And then, a payment matching one of the special protection accounts, the exact amount mentioned in the blackmail note. David looked up from the screen. This wasn't just financial ambiguity anymore. This was blackmail. Systematic. Organized. Intentional. The case of Rick Singer, the man behind the U.S. college admissions scandal, also began with unusual donations. No one questioned it, until one investigator noticed a strangely round $250,000 payment from a shady company to a charity linked to Singer. From there, a network of families, schools, and power connections slowly unraveled. The best scammers don't scare you right away. They make you feel unsure, confused, questioning whether you should even be suspicious. And by the time you're sure, you're already caught in the web they've spun. Their silence is their strongest weapon. David knew he wasn't a cop. He wasn't a detective. But right now, he was the only one who understood how the pieces fit together. He printed out a financial map, circled suspicious transactions, tracked repeating patterns in the system. Then he messaged Tom. "I need to see the old documents in Lynn's father's office. There might be more clues." And he was right. In an old drawer, behind a stack of tax files, was an unsealed envelope. Inside were 3 similar letters, dated months earlier. One of them was handwritten, barely legible. "If you don't want your past exposed, stop trying to clean it up." David gripped the letter tightly. This was no longer about missing money. This was a battle to protect a legacy under threat and a family about to welcome new life, while still haunted by an old fear. So David made his decision. He would not back down. When David walked into the conference room that morning, everything seemed to be going right. He wore a neatly pressed shirt, carried a folder full of data, charts, and analysis models, all prepared for a meeting with 2 executives from one of the city's top firms. This was the contract his company had chased for months. If they won, David would get promoted. A higher salary. A new title. A chance to expand into international markets. It was all within reach. But there was something no one in that room knew. Just hours earlier, David had received a text from Tom. "We just found out someone else in Grace's dad's company might be involved. Grace is really shaken. She hasn't been sleeping. When are you free? We need to talk." David placed his phone face down on the table. He began the presentation. Every word, every sentence came out as if rehearsed 100 times. But in his mind, he saw Lynn curled up on the sofa, hand on her belly, eyes filled with fear. The applause after the presentation felt distant. Then a young executive clapped David on the back. "We're impressed, David. Unless something unexpected happens, this contract is basically yours." David smiled. But inside there was no joy. He stood at a crossroads. Rightward arrow. One road led to dazzling success, the very thing he had worked his whole life for. Rightward arrow. The other was unclear, complicated, full of risk, tangled in someone else's troubles. But it was the right thing to do. Just like Howard Schultz, former CEO of Starbucks, who once rejected a mass layoff plan to protect profits during the 2008 crisis. Though heavily criticized, he chose to stand by his employees, and that decision became the foundation for the company's enduring human-centered culture. Right and wrong aren't always black and white. Sometimes, doing the right thing costs you what you thought mattered most. But in the end, it's those difficult choices that define who you really are. That afternoon, David emailed his boss. "I'd like to stay in the city for another week. I have a personal matter to handle." The boss agreed, no questions asked. After all, David had just saved the company's quarterly performance. David exhaled, as if lifting a weight off his shoulders. Then he called Tom. "I'm coming over tonight. We need to talk seriously." When he hung up, the sky had just begun to darken. Street lights flickered on. And somewhere deep inside, David understood. Success hadn't disappeared. It was just waiting for him at a different turn. Because now, he couldn't walk away from the people who had trusted him, not with business cards, but with their hearts. That evening, David arrived at Tom and Lynn's house earlier than expected. The house was unusually quiet. Lynn was sleeping, Tom said, after a long day of restlessness and mild contractions. But on the table lay everything they had found in her father's office. Among the messy piles of paper was an old notebook, its edges yellowed, each page filled with numbers and handwritten notes in blue ink. David opened it. The first page contained only 3 capital letters, C.H.I. Tom whispered, "We think it might stand for Clyde Harris Imports." David nodded slightly. He had seen that name. And now, it was no longer just a strange entry in a spreadsheet. It was the heart of a system that had quietly existed for years. The scribbled notes in the notebook listed special shipments, no labels, no codes. But the money involved was substantial. A payment of over $80,000 from a partner in Thailand. A shipment from Haiphong port. A comment, "Check again with Clyde Re, Insurance." David froze. The name Clyde Harris was no longer a theory. It was a critical link. He quickly matched these shipments with public bill of lading records. And then, something strange appeared. Rightward arrow, the quantities on the paperwork were higher than the actual contents. Rightward arrow, some containers labeled as mechanical parts were delivered to residential warehouses. Rightward arrow, several associated names matched companies previously investigated for money laundering. In the 2012 HSBC scandal, the bank had accidentally processed hundreds of millions of dollars from Mexican drug cartels through transactions disguised as transport contracts and technical services. It wasn't until an internal employee flagged unusually vague descriptions that the entire system began to unravel. David placed his hand on the notebook. He turned to Tom. "Your father-in-law wasn't just being manipulated. There's a possibility." He turned a blind eye. The room fell silent. Tom swallowed hard. "You think he knew what he was doing?" David shook his head. "I'm not sure. But if he did, maybe he believed that as long as everything ran smoothly, and his family was safe, he was just making a living. But now, when it's threatening the very people he meant to protect, the cost is far too high. A legacy is not just the assets you leave behind, but the story people will tell about you, after you're gone. And if we accept shortcuts, allow ambiguity to fester, then sooner or later, the darkness will come back for the ones we love most." Tom was quiet for a long time. Then slowly, "So, what do you think we should do now?" David replied gently. "We need more people. Someone who used to work with Clyde. Someone who knows the inside story. And if possible, we need to take this to a lawyer or a real investigator." That's when they remembered a name Lynn had mentioned in passing: Ronald, a former associate who had left the company after a major argument. Maybe he knew. Maybe he didn't. But he had stood beside Lynn's father for nearly 2 decades. David and Tom found Ronald on a chilly morning. His apartment was in an old building, peeling paint, hallways scented with coffee and old newspapers. Ronald, gray-haired, eyes weathered, opened the door with caution. "Who are you?" When he heard Lynn's father's name, he paused. "He passed away." Tom nodded. And in that moment, David sensed, despite the past fracture, there was something unresolved between them, a silent debt. They sat in the small room, light seeping through faded curtains. Ronald spoke slowly. "We started the business together. When we were young, broke, and full of illusions about the market." His voice lowered. "But then Clyde Harris showed up. At first, he was just a shipping partner. Then he became the guy who could make things go smoother." David asked, "Did you warn Lynn's father?" "I did more than that. I walked away. I refused to sign any more contracts. But he believed he was still in control." Ronald sighed. Maybe he thought, if he kept everything just below the legal line, it was still business. But Clyde wasn't the type to stop at the line. And once you cross it, there's no going back. David opened his bag and pulled out the threatening letter Tom and Lynn had received. The symbol in the corner, 3 letters intertwined, was identical to a stamp Ronald had once hand-drawn in the early days. Ronald froze. "This is a copy of a mark I created, only I, Clyde, and Lynn's father knew about it." No more words were needed. They all understood. Clyde was targeting anyone who still remembered the truth. Many believe justice only requires evidence. But in reality, many cases are only solved because someone dared to speak out. For example, Sharon Watkins, who exposed Enron, lost her job and was ostracized, but her testimony was the key to the entire investigation. Evidence can sit in a file cabinet, but truth only lives when someone is brave enough to bring it to light. Truth doesn't always win unless someone is willing to defend it. Justice doesn't arrive just through seals, documents, or digital trails. It comes from people who choose to stand up, even if their voices shake. Ronald looked at David, then at Tom, and slowly nodded. "I'll tell you everything I know. I'll sign whatever documents you need. But you have to protect Grace. That baby must not grow up in the shadow of old secrets." David didn't answer right away. He simply placed a hand on Ronald's shoulder, light, but firm. "We promise." That day, they left Ronald's apartment with a stack of documents, a handwritten statement, and an essential ally, not because Ronald was a witness, but because he had the courage to speak. The message came early in the morning. "Grace's water broke. She's at the hospital. Doctors say it might happen tonight." Tom sent it hurriedly. Just a few words. But as David read them, he felt his entire body pause. Not from fear but from emotion. Over the past 9 months, Grace had carried more than just a small life inside her. She had carried the weight of her father's legacy, financial instability, nights of fear from blackmail letters, and the haunting thought that she might bring a child into a world still clouded in chaos. And now, in that sterile hospital room, she was preparing to give birth to hope in the simplest and bravest way possible. David sat in the waiting area beside Tom, the man who had always appeared strong, now trembling as he held a lukewarm coffee cup in his hands. "You think everything will be okay?" Tom asked. David didn't answer right away. He looked out the window. The sky was turning light, a pale blue, clear and quiet, just like the morning they first met after that flight. "We've come a long way," David said. "And she's stronger than anyone you've ever known." About 5 hours later, the nurse appeared. Her face was like a small sun. "It's a girl. Both mother and baby are healthy." David and Tom jumped up at the same time. Tom clutched his head, laughing uncontrollably. "A girl. My daughter is healthy." They entered the room. Grace lay there, pale but at peace. In her arms was a tiny baby, pink and warm, eyes fluttering open and closed like dreaming of the world she'd just entered. "David," Grace whispered. "Come closer. You're a part of this, too." In many cultures, a child born after family tragedy is seen as a blessing, as a reconciliation between life and loss. In Rwanda, after the war, a baby girl was named Ituze, meaning peace, because she was born just as the community began healing from their pain. David looked at the baby. She gripped his finger, a miniature hand, unaware of the world, yet holding on to him as if to say, "Thank you." He didn't know what else to do but smile. She wasn't his daughter. But he felt bound to her, as if every sleepless night, every document, every threat, every hard choice had led to this moment. A moment of peace. Of completeness. Of being alive. Sometimes, life doesn't ask you to do something grand to redeem the past. It just asks you to stay when others would walk away. To hold someone's hand, even without shared blood, but with shared belief in what's right. The next day, David left the hospital to prepare for his return. He had done what he needed to do. The financial records were handed over to a lawyer. Ronald agreed to testify. The police had launched an official investigation. Clyde Harris, the man once shielded by ambiguity, would finally be brought into the light. But most importantly, that child would not grow up in fear. As David pulled his suitcase out of the hospital, Tom called after him. "Are you sure you're leaving the city today?" David turned back, eyes squinting with a smile. "Pretty sure, for now." Because he knew this journey wasn't over. It had only just closed one chapter to open another, where justice was no longer a distant concept, but something ordinary people could create simply by not walking away. David boarded the flight home, once again in first class, a gift from his company to celebrate the major deal he had helped secure. But he didn't feel like someone who had won. Instead, he felt light. As if he had just closed a heavy door, and a breeze now passed through an open window in his heart. He leaned back in his seat, still holding the old novel, the one he'd carried throughout this trip but never read closely. It opened to a passage where a minor character chose to do something kind, not for reward, but simply because it felt right. David smiled. Maybe that was the whole meaning of this journey. A few weeks later, he received the news. Clyde Harris, arrested. With full evidence, Ronald's testimony, and the documents David helped gather, the police had closed the case. No more threats. No more bought silence. No more past haunting Grace's family. Tom called. His voice shook over the phone. "You know what? Thanks to you, my daughter will grow up knowing that kindness isn't a weakness. It's the foundation for what's right." David's story echoes the actions of Dr. Omar Atiq, a physician in Arkansas, who forgave nearly $650,000 in medical debt for his patients during the pandemic. He said, "If I can do something small to help someone breathe easier, then it's not small at all." David's action was the same. Giving up a seat, something seemingly fleeting, became the first link in a chain of changes no one could have predicted. Sometimes, what changes someone's life isn't power, or status, or titles, but the willingness to step aside, so someone else can sit. You never know what you're starting when you choose to do what's kind. A few months later, David received an invitation. Grace's sister's wedding. A small, warm celebration. And a handwritten note along with the invite. "Thank you for believing even when no one else dared to." He came. Not as a hero. Just as a friend. Grace hugged him tightly. "She calls you Uncle D. No one taught her that. Maybe, she just feels it." David bent down and took the tiny hand again. The baby's smile, pure, unconditional, was a quiet reminder. His actions had planted a seed. And that seed was growing, day by day. After the party, David stood by the chapel window, watching people dance and laugh. He suddenly remembered that moment on the plane. When he stood up. Simply stood up. To give his seat to someone who needed it more. No one asked. No one applauded. It was just something he felt he should do. And from that seat a whole new life had begun. If you've ever felt like you're not big enough to make a difference, remember this. All the greatest changes start from one very small choice. One word. One glance. One action. One seat and one person who stood up. What about you? When was the last time you chose to do what's right even when no one asked? Share your story in the comments. You never know, maybe your story will inspire someone, somewhere. And if you'd like to keep following meaningful stories like this one, don't forget to follow the channel, turn on notifications, and share the video with someone you care about. Because kindness never goes out of style. And sometimes, it's the greatest thing an ordinary person can do.